Thank you so much. Please work your way back to your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you can imagine how full my heart is and what a deep honor this is. I'm not really supposed to make extensive comments here, so I'm going to be very brief, and I'm going to have a conversation here in a minute, but I really have to take the opportunity to express my deep, deep, heartfelt thanks to Linda and Lucy, to Ben Barnes and Liz McDermott, and to many others, some of whom I'll mention in a moment. Ben Barnes had the audacity to endorse me when I ran for president the first time at the age of 38 years old. And he had been lieutenant governor of Texas and was really the most powerful political figure in Texas. He may still be, I don't know. But Ben, you made those kind comments about my concession speech on election night. It wasn't really election night, it was 38 days after the election. And I appreciate that. But honestly, when people ask me about that, I say it's actually not that complicated. What I did was best summarized by Winston Churchill in his comments on the character of the American people when he said, "The American people generally do the right thing after first exhausting every available alternative." And I exhausted all the alternatives and found there was no intermediate step between a final Supreme Court decision and violent revolution, and I considered the latter briefly. But thank you, Ben. You've been a lifelong friend, and really I appreciate you inviting me to be here. And Liz, thank you for being part of this committee, and Mark Updegrove and Amy Banner Updegrove, thank you very much for leading this organization. And let me circle back to Linda. Linda Bird Johnson Robb and I have been friends for a long time, and her husband Chuck has been a longtime friend and ally. And Lucy Baines Johnson Turpin, thank you, Lucy. Lucy and I were actually in the same high school class, but at that time, in that era, the girls' school and the boys' school were kind of divided. I went to a school I graduated from a school called St. Albans in Washington, D.C., and she went to National Cathedral, and we shared one class. But I was frustrated that we couldn't get to those girls more frequently. But, and thank you, Lucy, for your gracious and moving comments about your granddaughter. I want to make sure that all of us fully appreciate the fact that our mistress of ceremonies here, Allison Lynn Camerata, is one of the great TV stars of our time. And Allison, we really appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. And Larry Temple, thank you for chairing this great organization and providing the guidance here. I've messed up on my protocol here. Lieutenant Governor Kathy Hochul, thank you, Lieutenant Governor. You honor us with your presence. And my former colleague and dear friend, Charlie Rangel, thank you so much for being here. We haven't had a chance to visit yet, but I'm going to get to you. I didn't see you in all this crowd before you arrived, Charlie, but we had the opportunity to work together quite a bit. And I want to acknowledge former HUD Secretary and a rising star in my political party, the Democratic Party, Julian Castro. Thank you for being here, Secretary Castro. Thank you so much. And my dear friend and longtime Chief of Staff, Peter Knight, is here. And there are so many others that I should acknowledge. So forgive me if I don't do so. This picture, let me say just a word about this picture. Ben, you talked about this picture. And yes, it was taken by Bill Anders and he was with Jim Lovell and Frank Borman, who was the commander of that mission. And they were focused on, they didn't land, as Ben noted for us. They were the first mission to circle the moon, looking for landing sites, and the only one to get all the way out to the moon before the moon landing the following July. They took this picture on Christmas Eve, 1968. The following July 11th was when the moon landing took place. But you know, President Lyndon Johnson immediately recognized the significance of this image, and it had a powerful impact on the consciousness of humankind. My friend Tom Johnson, who shaped CNN, we were talking about it earlier. It really changed the way we think about planet Earth. It has a name, this picture does, Earthrise. And on the NASA website, you can hear the audio tapes of the conversations inside the space capsule. And it's pretty interesting. As I said, they were looking down at the surface, and Bill Anders noticed out of the corner of his eye through the corner window this picture, and he went, "Oh my God!" And what ensued sounded like a family on vacation in a station wagon where the dad says, "Get my camera, quick, where's the color film? We need to take a picture of this." Literally, you can listen to it for yourselves if you Google it. And he took this picture, and it utterly transformed for all time the way people think about the Earth. But it was not just the picture. Here's what you need to know. President Lyndon Baines Johnson immediately sent a copy of this picture to every head of state of every nation on planet Earth. And he said, "Look at this," including Ho Chi Minh, by the way. And guided by the inspiration and determination of our great First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, he really did become a great, great environmentalist. And Allison mentioned some of his accomplishments. Just think, 15 national parks. I mean, really astonishing. And I was listening carefully and reading some of the tributes and reactions, and our hearts are with the Bush family, with the recent passing of Barbara Bush. And I remember reading, for example, Peggy Noonan's tribute to her, during which she turned her attention to Lady Bird Johnson. And one of the things she wrote about our great First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, was she said, "You know, when they came into the White House, we were throwing bottles and cans onto the side of the road. And by the time she left, somehow, we weren't doing that anymore." And that was her leadership. It wasn't all of her leadership by a long stretch. But we all know how this First Lady President equation works. And I know for a fact that her inspiration was incredibly important. And President Johnson's achievements in signing 300 environmental and conservation laws and really transforming the federal government's role. The Water Quality Act of 1965. And he said there's no excuse for communities to use other people's rivers as a dump for their raw sewage. And that insight is relevant today when we realize that we're using the thin shell of atmosphere surrounding our planet as an open sewer for the gaseous waste that is causing the climate crisis. The Clean Water Restoration Acts and Amendments, the Solid Waste Disposal Act, the Motor Vehicle Pollution Control Act, the Urban Mass Transit Act, and I could go on. This was an incredibly consequential presidency and leadership from the First Lady that really transformed our nation's approach to the environment. I want to say one other thing because, and we're going to have a little conversation here, and I've already gone too long, but my great mentor in my own personal life, when I was a college student back in the 1960s, I was fortunate to walk into a classroom of a great professor named Roger Revelle, who was one of the greatest climate scientists in history. And I had no idea of that or anything about it. And he inspired me, and that's really the reason why I began this journey, which I had no idea would take over my life. I really had. When I got to the House of Representatives, I asked, because of Professor Revelle, what's going on with global warming. This back in 1976, and the answer was, as they say, crickets. And I persuaded my committee chairman, one of my committee chairmen, to let me organize the first hearing in Congress on global warming. And I asked my professor to come and be the leadoff witness, and I naively thought that a 20-minute congressional statement would produce the same epiphany that had occurred inside my heart and mind after a full college course. And when it didn't happen, that's the first time I began to ask myself the question, how can this be communicated in a way that produces an aha realization like the one I had sitting in that class for a full course? Now, here's the reason I'm telling you this story. I recently found out. I thought I knew everything about Roger Revelle. I went and gave a speech at the 100th commemoration of his birth. And I did a lot of research on him then. And I found out, among other things, that President Lyndon Johnson had appointed him to be a member of his Science Advisory Board. And in 1965, Roger Revelle was the lead author of the Science Advisor's report to President Johnson. Some of you who may know some of these figures, Wally Brooker, Charles David Keeling, the greatest climate scientists of all time. There are some great ones right now as well. But here is what President Johnson received and made public in 1975, and I'm quoting from Roger Revelle's report to him. Pollutants have altered on a global scale the carbon dioxide content of the air. We can conclude with fair assurance that at the present time, fossil fuels are the only source of extra CO2 being added to the ocean, atmosphere, biosphere system. Through his worldwide industrial civilization, man is unwittingly conducting a vast geophysical experiment. Within a few generations, he is burning the fossil fuels that slowly accumulated in the earth over the past 500 million years. The climatic changes that may be produced by the increased CO2 content could be deleterious from the point of view of human beings. President Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson were leaders that expanded the moral imagination of our nation. And Charlie, the civil rights revolution that he wrote into law, the incredible advances in the promotion of social justice and the progress of Americans, we remember with pride and with gratitude. And the Beautification, Highway Beautification Act, my dad was the author of the interstate highway system, but that whole system was beautified by Lady Bird Johnson. I quoted Peggy Noonan earlier. She really created a new awareness and a new consciousness. And for me to be the recipient of this Lady Bird Johnson Award is really one of the greatest honors of my life. And I'd like to conclude by expressing my thanks to all of you for honoring her legacy by being here and by expressing your personal support for the values that Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson brought to our country and to our world. Thank you very much for this award.
You have quoted Mike Tyson, the boxer Mike Tyson, who once said famously, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face."
Yeah. There are a lot of other quotes you could use, but that's true. And that was my reaction to Donald Trump's election.
Well, and we'll get to that in a moment, but you had what you called a detailed plan for your future, and it entailed becoming elected president in 2000. Ben Barnes read your very gracious concession speech, and the Supreme Court gave the presidency to George W. Bush. I wonder, though, when you peeled yourself off the canvas after getting punched in the face and started waging this movement, which has become so successful, do you look back on that now as a mixed blessing in some ways? The fact that you did not get the presidency but were able to dedicate yourself to this all-important movement?
You know, Winston Churchill lost an election as a young man, and one of his friends said, "Winston, this is a blessing in disguise." And he said, "Damn good disguise." And I'm under no illusion that there's any position in the world with as much potential for doing good as the presidency of the United States. But that wasn't to be, and you move on, and I'm filled with gratitude and a sense of joy, really and truly, to have found work that justifies pouring every ounce of energy I have into it. So. No, and my plan actually was to be elected president when Ben Barnes and I were going at it and Peter Knight in 1988. But anyway, enough about ancient history.
When you started this campaign, there were so many naysayers.
Yeah. People
who called climate change a hoax, people who called you a fraud and accused you of fomenting fear falsely. When you won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, how did you feel? Was there a feeling of vindication in that? Was that what were you feeling at that moment?
Well, I've never thought it was about me. Every human being is tempted to interpret reality in terms of their own personal experience of it, but it's never been about me. So no, I did not. It was an opportunity to gain a bigger audience and to have a bigger impact, I hoped, and it has had that effect, and I'm grateful for that. That prize was great. You know, I'll tell you a quick story. I come from a little town of 2,000 people named Carthage, Tennessee. And President Johnson and First Lady Lady Bird Johnson came to our family farm in Carthage, Tennessee. And I've got pictures, and we honor that. Our mothers were wonderful friends, and our dads were too. They had some disagreements from time to time, but they remained great friends. And this little town of 2,000 people was also the home of a man named Cordell Hull, who was the Secretary of State for longer than anyone in American history. And he won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1945. FDR called him the father of the United Nations. He was also the father of the GATT that became the WTO. He was also the author of the 16th Amendment that made the income tax possible, and both of those latter achievements are a little controversial now, but most of us would think that they have helped build our country. Anyway, when the Nobel Committee in Oslo made their announcement, my little hometown newspaper of Carthage, Tennessee, the Carthage Courier, the slogan was the only newspaper in the world that gives a whoop for Smith County. Their headline for this news event was, Gore wins same prize Hull won. and and my parents were both had both passed by that time. But in my acceptance speech, I said with all the sincerity in my heart, there is absolutely no headline that would have had more meaning and consequence for my parents because they worship Cordell Hull. But in any case, it was an opportunity to get a bigger audience.
You said in an inconvenient sequel, which I commend to all of you if you haven't seen it, released last year, you said, in order to address the environmental crisis, we are going to have to start fixing the democracy crisis.
Yeah.
Because big money has so much to do with it now. Our democracy has been hacked.
Yeah.
You are alluding in this to the Supreme Court's decision in 2010 around Citizens United, which pours money into.
Yeah.
So given the fact that is in place, how do we fix our democracy?
Yeah, I want to quickly remedy an oversight. One of my other former colleagues in the Congress, Jim Jones, is here, and our former ambassador to Mexico. And Jim, I really appreciate you being here. Jim and Charlie and I served in the Congress during an era when members of Congress did not spend 5 hours every day begging rich people and special interests for money. I know it's hard to imagine such a day now, but we spent our time really, I came in '76, Jim and Charlie were already there, Charlie for quite some time, and we really, maybe I'm romanticizing the old days. I don't think so on this score. We really thought as a group way more than less about what the impact of the legislation we were considering was going to be on our constituents. And I saw the change happen. And Tom, you'll bear me out on this. Television took over from newsprint. And newsprint was the dominant medium when America was created. And our founders wrote to each other. And everybody could join the conversation. And the best expressions of what was good for the country would become more popular, like a Google search before they started tweaking it for the companies they own. But anyway, when television came in, it brought many benefits and blessings. But after a while, candidates for office and incumbents running for re-election began to understand that the coin of the realm was who could raise the most money to have the biggest war chest, to buy the most 30-second television ads. And that changed our democracy in two ways. People began to concentrate more than anything else on raising money, and it's still that way. Secondly, you think back to Thomas Paine. In January of 1776, a penniless immigrant from England, he had written Common Sense, walked out his front door in Philadelphia. There were 10 low-cost print shops within 12 square blocks, and it became the Harry Potter of the late 18th century and helped to inspire the American Revolution. You know, 2 centuries later, he does a 2-hour video called Common Sense, and he walks out his door to the nearest television station or a few blocks away to Comcast in Philadelphia and says, "When do I go on the air?" And the response is, "How many millions of dollars do you have?" And he doesn't go on the air. Gatekeepers were established on the boundaries of the public square, and only those with enormous amounts of money were able to go in and communicate with the consciousness of the American people. and it deprived us of our ability to harvest the wisdom of crowds. And the second big effect it had, I've already mentioned, candidates and members running for re-election had to focus all their time on raising money. That's what they do. And they do it to this day. And some of them have enough character and resolve to resist the temptations to bend their views and their policy preferences to please the donors of money. But human nature being what it is, most become vulnerable to paying more attention to what the effect of their words and their votes will have on the donors they're calling tomorrow. Our democracy has been hacked. Long before Vladimir Putin hacked our democracy, this agglomeration of lobbyists and big money came to occupy a dominant role. And they have a legitimate role to play, but not a dominant role. And now, all too often, the laws are written by the lobbyists and then just literally rubber stamped. And our nation rose to be the leader of the community of nations in the hearts and minds of people in every country in the world because we made better decisions consistently for 150 years than any other nation on earth because we drew from the wisdom of the American people. Of late, we've been making a lot of really dumb decisions because the basis of the decisions is too often not the wisdom and desires and heartfelt feelings of the American people. It's what the people with the gold and the wealth and the political power want. This may sound a little radical. I'm a raging moderate. I'm not a radical. But I've watched this, and I grieve what has happened to our American democracy, and I want it back. I want to restore it. I think we can. I won't take our time to spell out a plan, but I think there are ways to get it back. But our democracy is in deep, deep trouble. We have major policy decisions, not least on climate, based on absolute, utter, proven falsehoods, repeated over and over again as if the repetition will somehow make them seem true to people. The idea that the climate crisis is a hoax perpetrated by the Chinese, people giggle and laugh, and I understand, I have that impulse too. But that statement I just lampooned is the basis of the United States of America's policy today. What are we going to do about it? I know at a dinner like this, it's not a time to mobilize and pick up pitchforks and go out into the street. But as I said earlier, I want to recruit you. You've all contributed here. You're men and women of substance and means. We can change this. And don't think for a moment that you can't play a major role in helping to change it. We've got to change this. Our future is at stake. People hear that and they think, oh, he's exaggerating. Listen, when I was born, there were between 2 and 2.5 billion people in this world. Today, in my short lifetime, 70 is the new 69, by the way, we've gone from 2.5 to 7.8 billion. And we're slowly stabilizing population. It'll go to 10 or 11 before it levels out. But this is a success story unfolding in slow motion. But our technologies are infinitely more powerful than what our grandparents could have imagined. And in the business community, and I'm a part of the business community now, this focus on short-term results and quarterly reports and not taking responsibility for the long-term consequences of our present actions, our grandparents didn't think that way. And somehow we have, and the combination of these three things has completely transformed the relationship between human civilization and the ecological system of the planet. We've changed the radiative balance between our planet and our star. And we are the accumulated global warming pollution, man-made now, traps as much extra heat energy every single day as would be released by 400,000 Hiroshima-class atomic bombs exploding on this Earth every 24 hours. And it's a big planet, but that's a hell of a lot of energy. Look at what happened in Houston, Texas last summer. 5 feet of rain in 5 days, and all over the world, these rain bombs are falling. We had one in Nashville. Thousands of my neighbors lost their homes and businesses, and they didn't have any flood insurance because it had never, ever flooded before. And I could go through a list of hundreds of cities where that's happening every day. Look at the droughts. Right now, 20 million, I'm getting worked up, I'm sorry. But hold on. Today, as of this month, the United Nations has warned us that 20 million people in Africa are on the brink of starvation because we've never had so many droughts occurring simultaneously. And there are other factors mixed in with it. But Cape Town, South Africa, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, on the verge of being the first major city in the world of running out of water. I mentioned the fires in Oklahoma and Texas and Kansas and Colorado today. Biggest fire loss in the history of the U.S. Last year, the floods in this city, Superstorm Sandy. And not only Hurricane Harvey last year, but Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Maria, $320 billion in losses just last year, getting worse year by year by year. 1/2 of all the living species with which we share this planet at risk of extinction in this century. 1/2 of all the living animals that existed on this earth when most of us were born are dead today. 1/2 of all the animals, land-based plants and animals, moving toward the poles at an average rate of 15 feet per day on our watch. Now, here's the good news. I don't want to depress you too much. Here is the good news. We are now seeing a dramatic, historic reduction in the cost of electricity from solar and wind and the storage in batteries and electric vehicles that is almost as dramatic as the computer chip revolution. It is unbelievable. In most parts of the world, it's now cheaper than burning fossil fuels. The world is still subsidizing fossil fuels at 38 times the amount of the meager encouragements for renewables. But we are in the early stages of a sustainability revolution in this world that has the magnitude of the Industrial Revolution and the speed of the digital revolution. The Internet of Things, machine learning, artificial intelligence. We've seen businesses gain the ability to manage atoms and electrons and molecules with the same precision the IT companies have used in managing bits of information. We can win this. We have wind in our sails. But we have to have changes in policy. We can't have policy makers who, unlike Lyndon and Lady Bird Johnson, have no apparent concern about this earth or the environment in which we live. This may be improper, but I'd like to point out that there's an election coming up this fall and another one 2 years thence. Please, get involved. I don't care what party you are.
We don't have parting gifts tonight, but you will get a pitchfork at the door. Mr. Vice President.
Signed.
You wrote in Rolling Stone magazine in 2014, in the struggle to solve the climate crisis, a powerful, largely unnoticed shift is taking place. The forward journey for human civilization will be different and dangerous, but It is now clear that we will ultimately prevail. And you continued, writing, there will be many times in the decades ahead when we will have to guard against despair lest it become another form of denial, paralyzing action. 2 years after you wrote this article, we signed the Paris Climate Accord.
Right.
A year after that, Donald Trump withdrew our support of that agreement. Are you as sanguine now in 2018 as you were when you wrote this article in 2014?
Pretty much. Donald Trump has turned out to be capable of doing less damage than I feared he could. I went to see him after the election here in this city at Trump Tower on the Golden Elevator. And I continued my dialogue with him after he went into the White House. And I worked hard at that because I feared that if he withdrew from the Paris Agreement, it would serve as an excuse for other countries to also pull out. But I was so happy when the day after he made his speech, every other country in the world said, no, we're still in, we're there. And this state, New York, California under Jerry Brown, Washington State under Jay Inslee, 15 others, some of our biggest states all said, we're still in and we're going to ramp up. Hundreds of cities, have now made a commitment to go to 100% renewable energy. I was talking to Linda and Lucy earlier about Georgetown, Texas, where a conservative Republican Trump-supporting mayor in the heart of oil country, the reddest city in the reddest county in Texas, as he says it is, happens to be a CPA, looked at the numbers, made a commitment to go to 100% renewable energy, and he did, and the city did, and their electricity bills have come down. And helping to save the future of humanity is kind of a side benefit. And the business community is providing leadership. You mentioned I was on the board, Ben mentioned I'm on the board of Apple. I'm so proud of Tim Cook and Apple. They just announced 2 weeks ago they have now achieved worldwide 100% renewable energy. So has Google. So have 130 major multinationals have made this commitment. The U.S. is now on track to exceed the commitments it made in the Paris Agreement, regardless of what Donald Trump says or does. Market forces, technology, and innovation are driving this now. We're not moving fast enough. We need policy changes. But here's another thing people don't realize. Under international law, I helped write the agreement in Paris. Under international law and U.S. law, the first day upon which the U.S. could legally withdraw from the Paris Agreement happens to be the day after the next presidential election. And if there is a new president, excuse me for a moment, then a new president could give 30 days notice and we're right back in the agreement. So I do believe we will prevail. I really do. But here's the thing. Damage is being done every day. We have lost we've lost a lot of living species, more at risk, as I said. I won't go through the list. We still have the opportunity to avoid the truly catastrophic consequences. If we didn't act, it could end human civilization, really and truly. But the longer we wait, the more losses we will inflict on our children and grandchildren. Linda and Lucy and I are talking about our grandchildren as we do now. What do we want for them? The next generation will come to a time when they'll look back at what we did and said right now. We look back with great pride on what President Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson did more than a half century ago. A half century from now, what will the next generation think and say when they look back on what we did now? I want them to ask the question, how did you find the moral courage to
shake off the lethargy and remove the blinders and look plainly and clearly at the reality of what was going on, and then act. And I really and truly, I've said this twice before, I want you to act. I want you to be a part of this. Some of you will, I know some of you won't. But I hope that I can add to the number that will. And by the way, if you doubt for a moment that we collectively, as Americans, have the will to solve this, just remember that the will to act is itself a renewable resource. We're going to renew it.
Mr. Vice President, there's an old cliche that says it's easier to build a monument than it is a movement. The movement that you have built is literally changing our world. We thank you not only for being here tonight, but for everything you are doing to save this planet. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah. Well done. Thank you so much. Thank you.